Now we are going to focus on the neuromuscular system and how it responds to exercise by working alongside the muscular system in order to initiate a contraction. In order for a contraction to occur at the muscles, an impulse must be generated by the brain and sent via the spinal cord to the working muscles by the central nervous system in order to initiate the contraction. So the process starts by our sensory organs responding to a stimulus. So these are such as the eyes or the ears detects, for example, a ball coming through the air in rugby, and then this sort of response is sent to the brain by a sensory neuron. The brain is in charge of making decisions to produce the signal, which is known as an action potential, that is sent down a motor neuron to the muscle fibers. The structure of a motor neuron is very important in transporting the action potential. And as we can see in the diagram, that the axon of the motor neuron is how the impulses are transported. As you can see on this motor neuron, there is a thermal insulator known as the myelin sheath. This helps to increase the speed of the impulses so they can travel to the muscles at a faster rate. If the motor neuron did not have this myelin sheath and have no insulation, the impulses will travel much slower, so the initiation isn't as rapid. The myelin sheath aims to insulate the axon, and it causes the wave of depolarization to move over these gaps that it leaves by saltatory conduction. So this is when the charges on the impulses switch with each jump, and through the roads of Ranvier through to the dendrites of the terminal branches. From here the impulse travels to the neuromuscular junction, which leads into the muscle fibre. The impulse reaches the presynaptic membrane, and a neurotransmitter is released known as ACH, which will help the diffusion across the synapse happen at a faster rate. The impulse spreads across the synapse and binds to the receptors on the postsynaptic membrane of the muscle cell, where it is then packaged into a vesicle and transported through the T-tubules and into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is a calcium store. Within the muscles, there are muscle fibers which have proteins that are organised into large chains that can shorten and relax. These are the actin and myosin filaments, which are controlled by an impulse, which then causes them to shorten or relax the muscle, which is known as the sliding filament theory. There are open channels which allow an influx of sodium ions into the cytoplasm and sends a message to trigger the release of the calcium ions, which then diffuses into the muscle fibers. The relationship between the chains of protein within the muscular cell changes, leading to the contraction. And similarly, if we stop moving, in order to stop the impulse and the muscle contraction, the stimulation of the motor neuron provides the impulse to the muscles to stop, and the chemical reaction which causes the rearrangement of muscle fibers is stopped. So this reversing the process in the muscles, causing it to relax. So there is no contraction. And this is associated with the somatic nervous system, which is the part of the peripheral nervous system associated with the voluntary control of body movements via the skeletal muscles. It consists of afferent nerves, which are known as sensory nerves, or efferent nerves, that are motor nerves. Afferent nerves are responsible for relaying sensation from the body to the central nervous system, while efferent nerves are responsible for sending out commands from the central nervous system in order to stimulate muscle contraction. They include all the non-sensory neurons connected with skeletal muscles and the skin. So the basic route of nerve signals within the efferent somatic nervous system is to do with a sequence that begins in the upper cell bodies of motor neurons, which are stimulated from the precentral gyrus and down the corticospinal tract through the axons to control the skeletal muscles. And so once they have passed down the central nervous system to the muscle, and this can then trigger the sliding filament theory and allow the muscle to contract or shorten. Specifically, if we are trying to get the muscle to contract, it will use the sympathetic nervous system by an accelerator nerve in order to speed up the impulse so the contraction happens at a faster rate. And similarly, if we want to stop the muscle contracting, we send an impulse down the vagus nerve by the parasympathetic nervous system in order to prevent the actin and myosin forming the cross bridge, and therefore the muscle cannot shorten. Now we're going to be looking at motor units and how the brain has to recruit them in order to help initiate muscular contraction. So a motor unit is composed of a motor neuron and the skeletal muscle fibres, which are innervated by the motor neuron's axon terminals. Mainly groups of motor units work together in order to produce a coordinated contraction of a single muscle. Within a motor unit, all the muscle fibres are of the same fibre type, so they're all rather slow oxidative fibres, fast oxidative glycolytic fibres, or fast glycolytic fibres. There's never a mix between the three of them. So when a motor unit is activated, the fibres are forced to contract. So for example, in vertebrates, the force of a muscle contraction is controlled by the number of activated motor units. Another factor that affects the contraction is the number of muscle fibres within each motor unit, and it can vary from muscle to muscle. So the bigger muscles like the quadriceps or the hamstrings that have a larger body mass will have more muscle fibres and therefore more motor units, whereas the smaller muscles of the lower leg and of the arms would have fewer muscle fibres in each motor unit. So the muscles that possess more motor units have a greater individual motor neuron innervation, which makes them more able to control force output more finely so they can manipulate it. And as we can see, the graph on the right shows that the stronger the muscle and the more the size of the motor units affects the fatigability of that muscle. So the graph shows that the weak muscles that have small motor units have a slow resistance to fatigue. So this would be more for the aerobic exercises, so marathon runners and more endurance athletes, whereas the strong muscles that require large motor units are fast fatigable. So that's the anaerobic exercises like sprinting, shot put, more the maximal exercises. But they generate force at a faster rate, as we can see, than the slow motor units cannot generate as much force as the larger motor units of the muscle, which is why obviously our bigger muscles are used for more energetic exercises. So we need to generate much more force with our leg muscles when we're doing sports like football in order to generate more force than, say, when we're doing archery. When we're using the arms, we're not using as much force as we would in order to kick a football. So the central nervous system is mainly responsible for the recruitment of motor neurons, especially the brain, and they are recruited based on the size of the load and depending on the sport. So, like I said, for the smaller loads that require less force, the slow twitch, low force and fatigue resistant muscles would be activated. Whereas if we have a high intensity activity, we're going to have more of the fast twitch, high force and less fatigue resistant muscle fibres. So they're used to generate those higher forces needed in those activities. So the central nervous system works in two ways in controlling these force produced by the muscle and through the motor unit recruitment. This is the spatial recruitment and the temporal recruitment. Spatial recruitment is activating more motor units initially to produce a greater force. So the larger motor units, along with the small motor units, until all the muscle fibers in a single muscle are activated, so it produces the maximum muscle force. So this would be in exercises such as weightlifting. When we're trying to generate the maximum force, our legs are having to contract at a constant rate and at high intensity in order for us to generate the force needed to lift the weight and sustain it over our head. The temporal motor unit recruitment is the frequency of the activation of the muscle fiber contractions. So it's that stimulation of the motor unit fibers consistently from the alpha motor neuron, which causes the twitching to fuse temporarily. And this in turn produces a greater force than a singular contraction, as it decreases the interval between the stimulations to produce a larger force with the same number of motor units. Every movement of the body has to be correct in order of force, speed and position. These aspects of movement are continuously reported to the central nervous system by receptors which are sensitive to position, posture, and to maintain equilibrium conditions in the body. These receptors are known as proprioceptors, and these are responsible for keeping a continuous report on the position of limbs, like the muscle spindles and tendon organs. So on the slide we have the muscle spindle apparatus and the Golgi tendon organs. These two structures are important in detecting the stretch and tension that the muscle inevitably produces and influence the nerve signals to the muscles. The muscle spindle is located in the skeletal muscles, and there are extrafusal fibers which are responsible for initiating a contraction. This is due to the fact that they contain actin and myosin filaments, so they can shorten the muscle in the sliding filament theory by the cross-bridge and power stroke action. In the middle of the myofibril there are intrafusal fibers, which do not contract and are more involved in detecting the stretch of the muscle over the joint. So the muscle spindle apparatus are wrapped with nerve fibers. These are innervated by nerves to sense the stretching of the muscles. By sending a signal to the spinal cord and the interneurons which connect the afferent sensory signals to an efferent signal, like the alpha motor neuron. This signal would then come back to the muscles in order to initiate contraction and prevent the stretching. So inevitably it stops the muscle from overextending and prevents injury. The ends of the intrafusal fibers contain actin and myosin filaments, and a motor neuron can stimulate these to stretch, which is known as the pre-stretch phase, and send a signal back to the spinal cord through the interneurons to produce a stronger stimulus to the muscle. So both of these proprioceptors play a huge role in flexibility. The Golgi tendon organs and muscle spindle work together reflexively in order to regulate muscle stiffness. When a Golgi tendon organ is stimulated, it causes its associated muscle to relax by interfering with its contraction. When a muscle inhibits a Golgi tendon organ, this process is known as autogenic inhibition, and it stops it from initiating a contraction. The function of the Golgi tendon organ can be considered opposite of the muscle spindle, and it serves to produce muscle contraction, while the muscle spindle apparatus aims to prevent it, so it prevents stretching of the muscle. So the muscle spindle is wrapped around muscle fibers, and as the muscle stretches or lengthens, it pulls on the spindle, causing it to lose its spiral shape and stretch. This signals the muscle to contract